the other.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Brunt, I'm asked to clarify a couple of matters with you. First of all, if we can return to the RIDDOR regime and the guidance during the pandemic in relation to reporting incidents of COVID-19 infection in healthcare settings. You have set out in your witness statement that the condition known as long COVID is not reportable under RIDDOR as any occupational exposure to a biological agent that causes COVID-19 occurs at the time of initial infection. As long COVID occurs later, it is not reportable. Would it be correct to say that it is the infection with COVID-19 due to occupational exposure that's reportable rather than any long-term consequences?
Exactly. The reportability is the exposure to the infectious agent, not the consequence of the exposure.
So whether someone develops COVID, long COVID subsequently, doesn't make any difference to how reportable the initial infection was?
Absolutely. You could theoretically be reporting an exposure. If you had a release in a laboratory, you could report an exposure that didn't lead to any infection at all. So it's the act, the event that is the reportable.
Thank you very much. And I'm also asked to clarify a point in relation to the evidence that you gave this morning. You were asked whether the Health and Safety Executive had had a position on airborne exposure to COVID-19 in relation to non-aerosol generating procedures. And this was your answer. I'm taking this from the transcript. I believe at the time the scientific advice and our chief scientific advisor will have been part of the national bodies sharing such information, that at the time this was drafted, it was considered that airborne aerosol transmission wasn't a factor other than those aerosol generating procedures. And this is the part that you were asked about. You went on to say, so we will have challenged the science behind this and made sure that we were satisfied as a regulator that that was the best available information at the time. Are you aware whether the Health and Safety Executive did in fact challenge the science behind it and make sure that you were satisfied as a regulator that that was the best information? What steps did you take?
I mean, that would have been the role with our chief scientific advisor of developing that understanding and where we were. So it was that advisory and discussion role across government so that we could understand where we were. And our chief scientific advisor was also a member of SAGE, would have attended there.
So the HSE has its own chief scientific advisor?
We do, Professor Andrew Curran.
And so far as you're aware, did the HSE's chief scientific advisor challenge that, what was perhaps the orthodoxy at the time?
I wouldn't be aware of any conversations he's had specifically. I know he was a part of that forum and that was his role. And the conversations I've had with him would lead me to believe he's been part of those discussions and had an opinion. I do remember talking to him during the course of the pandemic and the point at which he said to me, I have been persuaded and seen new evidence. I now believe there's an aerosol route. So his original opinion and his challenge would have been that he saw this as a droplet.
Thank you. If we can move on, please, to lessons learned by the Health and Safety Executive in relation to the COVID pandemic. I think the Health and Safety Executive undertook a report reviewing the effect of COVID-19 in the workplace, and that was published in January 2021 and based on Health and Safety Executive data between April and September 2020. And arising out of that, or indeed any of the other reflective work that the Health and Safety Executive have undertaken, how would you summarise what lessons have been learnt by the HSE that can be applied to workplace health and safety in healthcare settings in future pandemics?
I think one of the key things was being able to respond quickly to emerging evidence, being able to keep alive and keep reviewing the information that's coming out. I think there was a very clear need identified for clear communication, and that links to some of the things we've talked about this morning of messaging on PPE, etc. So it's being able to make sure everybody understands what's happening and how things are developing.
And do you consider that in a future health pandemic, the Health and Safety Executive would be likely to take a different approach to health and safety in healthcare settings, and particularly things like the Riddle reporting regime?
I think each one of these would have to be judged on its merits. We don't see many pandemics in anybody's lifetime. As an organisation, we have to have that organisational memory of what we've done and so on. But those decisions were based around the evidence and the science as we saw it in this case, and the approach would be the same, but whether or not the decisions would depend on that evidence.
Thank you very much. I have no more questions for you, Mr. Brunt. My lady, I understand there are some questions.
But there are others. So you've not escaped just yet. Mr. Stanton, I think you're going first.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Brunt. Firstly, I apologise for this slightly awkward positioning. Please don't feel any need to turn to face me, but do so if you wish.
And we have to get everything you say recorded.
Absolutely. Making sure I can hear.
Okay. So hear and then turn to me.
Of course.
Thank you.
Mr. Brunt, I'd like to show you an exchange of correspondence between the BMA and the HSE. The first document, which hopefully will be brought up on your screen, is INQ 0000097909. And this is a joint letter of the BMA and the Royal College of Nursing from the 21st of January 2021. At the first paragraph there, you'll see second sentence. It states, "We write to you with concerns about the ongoing threat posed to health and care staff following the identification of the SARS-CoV-2 variant and your regulator's role in preventing work-related ill health, death or injury." Next paragraph, "Our very serious concerns relate to the risk of aerosol/airborne infection. RCN and BMA members working in all settings are raising concerns that they are not adequately protected. Our members are concerned that fluid-repellent surgical face masks and face coverings, as currently advised in most general healthcare settings, do not protect against smaller, more infective aerosols." And then right down at the bottom of the page, Mr. Brunt, "We are calling for the Health and Safety Executive to take a precautionary approach and to use your role as a regulator to ensure employers and those developing national guidance meet and understand their responsibilities." And then over the page at the first paragraph, there is a request for you to review the IPC guidance and to make an assessment of the use of appropriate PPE across settings. And your chief executive responded on the 29th of January. This is within document INQ 00417574 at the second page, please. And right at the top, it's stated in response, "Before publication of the revised guidance on the 21st of January, a clinical and scientific review was carried out, and as the guidance states, no changes to the recommendations, including PPE, have been made in response to the new variant strains at this stage. However, the position will remain under constant review." And then next paragraph, "Whilst HSE will not be undertaking a review, as this has already been done by those responsible for the guidance, we will continue working closely with the DHSC and other government departments," etc. I don't think we need to go any further. Mr. Brunt, just pausing there, this exchange of correspondence took place at the very height of the pandemic in January 2021, when hospitals and healthcare workers were overwhelmed with COVID patients. The correspondence is also on behalf of some 750,000 healthcare workers whom RCN and BMA represent. And it took place at a time when there was widespread acknowledgement of the risk of aerosol transmission. So in these circumstances, I'd like to ask you, given the HSE's long-standing position from well before the pandemic that surgical masks are not RPE and do not provide adequate protection against airborne transmission, can you explain why the HSE refused to engage with the BMA and the RCN on this important issue?
I think we gave a full response based on the questions we'd been asked. As we've explained in my evidence this morning, that position of HSE working with other government departments in support of the national response to COVID, constantly keeping things under review, as we stated in this response, that recognition that those things have to, we have to iterate the guidance, etc. This was the response based on the position at that time and our understanding. We fully recognised the significant pressures that the health services were working under, and we were part of that overall response of the IPC, the Department of Health, etc., in trying to take that forward. So to be able to pick up that when we're already dealing with it at that national level was a key part of our response to this.
I think the point that Mr Stanton's making is that by January 21, widespread acknowledgement, including by the sounds of it, by your own Chief Scientific Advisor, that this was an airborne virus, and that you've always accepted that certain kind of masks weren't suitable. So why doesn't something change? This looks a bit like a fobbing off.
I think this, as I say, we were looking to the Public Health England and DHSC as the leads on pandemic, how we're working with them, making sure that guidance is suitable based on what we knew at the time. I know I said that Andrew Curran's position changed. I couldn't put a date on that off the top of my head. I don't know, and I would be very confident that when we've drafted this response, we will have taken that into account.
Sorry, interrupted, Mr Stanton.
No, thank you, Chair. Mr Brunt, leaving aside the slight irony in responding by saying the guidance will be kept under constant review and then refusing to review it, I don't know if you heard the evidence of Dr. Barry Jones of Qatar this morning, who expressed the view that at every turn his organisation was managed and pushed away when they tried to make representations of a similar nature. The BMA certainly feels that they were being managed and pushed away by your response. Is the reason for that because there wasn't any scientific basis to your response?
I think that our response was based on that position at that time. As I've said before, we'd taken account of the advice we're getting from our chief scientists, from other scientific advisors working in that cross-government position, recognising that the lead on this was others, and we are part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Brunt. Can I take you to another document, please? This is INQ 000269711, page 11. This document is helpfully exhibited by you to your statement, and commendably, it is a lessons learned document, that the HSE commissioned and asked the Workplace Health Expert Committee to undertake. It reported in May 2022, and at page 11, which I see you have before you, right at the bottom under the heading Airborne Spread, it states, or it finds, aerosol transmission was underestimated significantly at the outset and for some months thereafter. Controls were therefore less effective than they could have been, notably in settings like health and social care. And it goes on to indicate a particular lesson learned. That is, all plausible routes of transmission for a novel biological agent should be considered, and an initial precautionary approach to risk management should be adopted. And then just, if I could take you to another page, a final page from this document, page 17, you'll hopefully see 4 bullet points at the top of the page. Again, further lessons learned in this area. Use of simple PPE was afforded undue prominence early on in the pandemic, and this has had lasting consequences on perceptions of its importance as a control measure. Next point, in contrast, the use of more effective respiratory protective equipment was downplayed in the early stages of the pandemic, and that may have contributed to higher infection rates. Third point, understanding of the different types of respirators and the differences between these and face coverings remains suboptimal. And the final point, early and consistent messaging about the real value of PPE and face coverings should be a priority in any future pandemic involving a respiratory disease. Mr. Brunt, I'd like to ask you whether the HSE accepts that these identified concerns, coupled with the refusal to engage with the RCN and the BMA on these very same issues, identifies failures on the part of the HSE to discharge your statutory responsibilities?
I think it's very good that we are looking at that process of review and learning. This is, as we've said, published in 2022, a retrospective. It is also looking broadly across the whole of the situation and all industries, and some of those nuances about PPE. I think it's really important that we recognise and we learn from those, and we take those into account. It does come back to, from a health and safety at work point of view as well, not putting all the emphasis on PPE, and that's the hierarchy of control that has always been there. So it's really important that we do learn these lessons and take those forward.
Thank you, Mr. Brunt. Just moving to a slightly different area, this is my final question. Can I ask, what role did the limited supply of RPE play in the way the HSE sought to discharge its responsibilities?
I think the only role that played is that it emphasised the importance of what we were doing to make sure PPE was available. The situation the setup we had for making sure we could do the regulatory easements for adequate and suitable PPE that met the right standards but wasn't CE marked, the efforts we put into making sure that that could be distributed, the support we gave to that supply chain. So I think we did as much as we were able to within that regulatory framework to facilitate the supply of PPE.
If I could just briefly clarify, Mr. Brunt, the reason for asking that question is because the BMA and other organisations are slightly scratching their heads because they don't see any scientific basis for the IPC guidance, which remained in place for so long. And I'm asking whether, instead of a scientific underlying basis, actually was the IPC guidance drafted in the way it was because of concerns about the supply of equipment such as FFP3?
I'm not aware of those final decisions at the IPC. Certainly HSE's input was that if PPE is required, it is required. We shouldn't be getting away from that. That's the requirement, and it should protect. It is also part of an overall risk control mechanism and has to be considered in that totality.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brunt. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. And I think next is Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. Mr. Brunt, these are questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. Good afternoon. Firstly, inspections. Very roughly, what is the number of inspections of workplaces across all sectors in an ordinary year?
Currently, that would be around about 14,000 inspections a year.
And the healthcare sector generally is considered to be lower risk, well-controlled risk, and an area for lower inspections, isn't it?
It is. We prioritise work based on our inspection work based on the risk profile of the industries that we regulate, and also where we have specific intelligence of businesses that aren't performing or managing risk as we would expect. So healthcare settings are considered to be, in many of those high-risk areas, they're better performing.
And no issue is taken with that, Mr. Brunt, generally. And we can see that, can't we? Because in the year prior to the pandemic, of those 14,000-odd inspections, 95 were in healthcare settings. That's paragraph 87 of your statement.
That's correct.
When the pandemic hit, the number of inspections of healthcare settings was 81. That's paragraph 92 of your statement. How can it be in circumstances that healthcare workers are facing a new and significant risk, even before it hits our shores? There's reports of healthcare workers dying in China and Italy. Those healthcare workers know, indeed the public knows, that they are fighting it with serious problems with PPE and the like. There's early reports of healthcare workers in the UK dying. How can it be that in those circumstances, the number of inspections doesn't go up and, in fact, goes down?
I think inspection isn't the only form of regulation. In that year, when the pandemic broke out, like every other work activity, we had to take stock of whether or not we were key workers and when to intervene and not intervene. We also have to consider the role of inspectors visiting places that there is high numbers of COVID patients, as whether or not we would become part of that vector. But the key thing is that to be able to regulate an industry, as I explained this morning, is as much about providing information, advice, and working through others as it is about inspecting. So to use the levels of inspection we did helps us understand what's going on. We don't have to inspect every premises to be able to provide advice to all of them.
Not every premises, Mr. Brunt, but the numbers were extraordinarily low, weren't they? In fact, the HSC stepped back from its role in the healthcare sector of monitoring, of looking at what was going on in healthcare premises. That was just wrong, wasn't it?
You're talking about a number of inspections as if that's the only means of providing information. So to say the number of inspections reflect whether or not we stepped up or stepped back doesn't reflect the input, the liaison we're having with the Department of Health, the health services, and how that regulatory effect is going through others.
Well, if we look at some of those alternatives, Mr. Brunt, one was spot checks and spot inspections. There are over 400,000 in your statement, that's paragraph 207, but 483 of those were in healthcare settings, 0.1%. So it wasn't the case, was it, that spot checks and spot inspections were really focused in any meaningful way on healthcare? Do you agree with that?
They were focused on COVID-19 across the whole of the GB regulatory regime, as indeed they should have been.
Yes, but in terms of focus on healthcare, we've heard lots of evidence about high death rates, high rates of long COVID, PTSD and the like, in circumstances in which there are real profound problems in safety measures. Was there a fundamental difficulty, Mr. Brunt, of the Health and Safety Executive, when we look at it realistically, just being absent?
I don't think so at all. I think we were playing a very significant role through those various channels, and we were playing a role in a government national response to a pandemic. We don't target specific sectors when that pandemic is happening right across all of them.
Would it be fair to say, Mr. Brunt, that when the Health and Safety Executive did inspect, on the few occasions it did, it found actually quite significant problems with health and safety practices in hospitals?
I think we found a spectrum, and it's reflected in my statement and some of the exhibits, that when we inspected, we found differing levels of performance. We found things that we would see where good leadership was generally reflected in good standards, where leadership wasn't being shown in the same ways, and indeed was mentioned this morning. We could find lower levels of compliance in the non-clinical areas when there was good levels of compliance in clinical areas. So we found varied performance, as we do indeed across lots of areas that we regulate. And again, the proportionality is taking that learning and that knowledge and sharing it with those that need to use it so that they can improve.
And on those themes you described, Mr. Brunt, of the importance of leadership being present, non-clinical areas having lower compliance, it matches with accounts that the inquiry has heard. But in your statement, you described December and January 2020 and 2021, 17 acute hospitals visited, and 12 of them received advice or written advice. Is that not the sort of valuable and important inspection that needs to be increased in the next pandemic if we focus on learning lessons?
I think, as I said earlier, the response has to be in context of what we're facing. So you can't give a blanket response as to something that may happen in the future. It is certainly the learning that has to be taken into account.
Mr. Brunt, in the very short time I have left, I'm going to ask about RIDDOR. Okay. Rather than ask you about the wording of the guidance, what reasonable evidence does not mean, can I ask you this? In terms of an outcome, should a health and safety regulator want to know if a healthcare worker who has been in contact with COVID positive patients has died, should they want to have a report to that effect?
We have to look in terms of, as a regulator, we are regulating work activities. So to understand what's happening and to be able to investigate those circumstances is important. It still comes down to our role in regulating the workplace and work activity. So yes, we do need to understand if that work has led to a death. We need to understand that and to be able to take the appropriate action. But it is still a judgment of that business as to the effect of deciding whether that work activity was contributory and there was reasonable evidence of that.
Mr. Brunt, you've repeatedly referred to that exercise of judgment, and in exhibits to your statement, there's stats of some hospitals in the entirety of the pandemic making one RIDDOR report as part of that judgment. Should the guidance as to that judgment not be changed so that RIDDOR reports are made?
The duty on RIDDOR, and if we're looking at the guidance generically...
Sorry, Mr. Brunt, I'm going to interrupt. Let's focus on the next pandemic. So rather than the niceties of RIDDOR, let's focus on what needs to happen in the next pandemic. Should it be the case that where a healthcare worker dies of COVID, the health and safety regulator should be told about it?
If that was caused by their work, yes, but just because a healthcare worker dies of COVID, as indeed if anyone else dies of COVID, I'm afraid to link that for a RIDDOR report still has to be linked to that work activity.
My lady, I'm probably pushing my patience. Can I ask just one more?
I'm in a very generous mode today.
Clearly, that judgment is, with the nature of a pandemic, going to be sometimes difficult. But is it a problem that it rests exclusively with the hospital, in the case of a hospital, rather than the information being provided to the regulator so that the regulator can see the picture, rather than have a scenario where, in a whole pandemic, they get one RIDDOR report from a hospital?
The duty under RIDDOR lies with the responsible person. That is clearly defined. So it imposes that duty so that they do apply their legal obligations of being able to understand what's happening in their positions. So for them, it is abrogating that duty as much just to report everything and not think about it, as it is to actually consider what's happening in their workplace and coming to an opinion.
I think that's probably as far as I can take it. Thank you very much, my lady.
Mr. Jacob wasn't being rude. He has. They all have limited time.
I
and
understand,
that's why he was
my lady.
cutting
Thank
across.
you.
Right, Mr. Thomas, I think you're next.
Good afternoon, Mr. Brunt. Again, don't feel the need to look in this direction.
Thank you.
I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. As you may know, FEMHO has been deeply concerned with the challenges faced by Black, Asian and minority ethnic healthcare workers, particularly during the pandemic, where issues around the adequacy and appropriateness of PPE and respiratory protective equipment were of paramount importance. So let me just give you a little bit of context to the question that I've got for you. It's this. In your witness statement at paragraph 301, that's on page 66, that's INQ 000347822, that's where the document's found. You note that the Chief Executive of the NHS Trust asked the Health and Safety Exec to remove the requirement for fit testing and replace it with a fit check, as fit testing was putting strain on resources. And then further at between paragraphs 303, you explain that the HSC could not provide a derogation from this requirement, as it would have led to inadequate protection for staff and undermine the regulatory requirements. And you further clarify that at paragraphs 304 to 306, where you say that the responsibility for addressing these supply chain issues rested with the employer, and that a fit check should never be used as a substitute for a proper fit test. So, coming to the question. In the light of the significant challenges faced by ethnic minority healthcare workers, many of whom had higher failure rates in that fit tests due to facial features and characteristics, cultural factors such as facial hair, and inadequate PPE provisions during the pandemic. Question. To the extent that healthcare workers from ethnic minorities were subject to fit checking rather than fit testing, would you agree that this was an example of cutting corners that put those workers at increased risk?
I think, as we've said there, you're absolutely right. If we're going to use PPE, respiratory protection of that type, it does have to be fit tested to know it's offering that protection. And if that was not happening, those employers were not meeting their duty.
So this is my final point. So just help me with this. We've heard so many stories about these issues and these problems. Why didn't the HSC do anything to address this issue to make sure that healthcare employers were complying with this requirement?
The action we took was to make sure we were drawing this through the attention, through that supply chain, through the DHSC and the National the health trusts, to make sure they understood their duty. And clearly in the responses we've gave them, that you cannot use RPE if it's not been fit tested. And you've mentioned specifically people with facial hair for religious reasons, and I know we were in correspondence with various organisations on that, and the use of alternative forms of respiratory protective equipment when you cannot use an FFP type.
So in a nutshell, you say the HSC was doing enough?
I think we were doing what we needed to through those chains to make sure that those people understood what their duty was.
My lady, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Simbler, I'm afraid everybody's coming from behind you.
Being ambushed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Brunt. I'm asking questions on behalf of the COVID Airborne Transmission Alliance. I think you had correspondence with various members of them during the pandemic. I'm not going to ask you about the correspondence, but that's who I'm asking questions on their behalf. And the first, I suppose it's an obvious point, but the Health and Safety Executive would know that many activities carried out by healthcare workers involve being close up to patients and sometimes other colleagues, close quarters working. Would you agree that would be known about and obvious?
As I'd agree, that is very obvious.
Thank you. And it's in that context I want to ask a couple of questions about what the HSE knew about transmission and risk. Could we have on the screen, please, INQ 000269-803, and then second page of that? And I've asked for paragraph 7 to be highlighted. This is an HSE document in which a number of people, or in which it is summarised what the risk factors for COVID-19 are. And we can see from that one, COVID-19 was known by the HSE to be an airborne disease. Do you agree?
We refer to aerosol as droplets, and we refer to aerosol generating procedures, so there's a correlation there.
So the date of this document, Mr. Simba?
I can't find the data.
Oh, I see, right.
So one of the things I was wondering if the witness knows the data.
I
know it's a bit.
I can't tell
know
you based on that.
blindsided by it. And, yes, all right. Well, but the second point, that infectious persons expel virus-containing aerosols, and that the concentration of these aerosols and risk is greatest within 1 metre. So would you agree with those propositions, and those appear to have been known to the HSE?
The information there, I think, is reflecting that totality of what was in the IPC guidance. So if there's an aerosol is generated, that is one route. We talk about touching a surface that's contaminated and so on. So there's that range of transmission possibilities in the different circumstances is understood.
Right. So within 1 metre, i.e. the sort of area in which healthcare workers work. Now, in that context, I want to ask you something about what you understood about fluid-resistant surgical masks. And I think this morning in your oral evidence, you made clear that these are medical devices. You wouldn't call them PPE. Mm-hmm. And it is your understanding, and was your understanding at the time, that such fluid-resistant surgical masks would not provide in themselves adequate protection in close quarters working. Do you agree with that?
They're not adequate protection for aerosols. They're there for droplet protection, source protection. The fluid resistance is in case the bodily fluids expelled towards the person that's wearing them.
Thank you. And can I have your a piece of your witness statement displayed, please? INQ 000347822, page 85, and it's paragraph 402. I think that's coming on screen now. I hope it'll be shown. Yes, so this is what you've put in your witness statement. You've explained what you regard about what you just elaborated on there, and it's particularly the last sentence I want to ask you about, because you put, however, there's a common misperception that they will provide protection against aerosols. And my question's this. Since you know that surgical masks do not provide adequate protection, and that there is a common misperception that, amongst others, that they do provide protection, why didn't the HSE provide instructions that the healthcare workers required respirators?
I think that's reflected in the IPC guidance, that where we believe there was aerosol generating procedures, they used FFP3. And outside of those areas, that's where they were using fluid-resistant surgical masks.
And related to that question, do you recall a meeting in 2022 where various people asked the HSE to give a clear and unequivocal message about people wearing FFP respirators, and some follow-up correspondence to that? Do you remember that being specifically requested?
In answer to your question, do I recall the meeting? I don't.
Well, do you recall being asked by, I think it was the RCN and others, for the HSE to send a clear message about that? And there being some discussions about that?
I'll be honest, I don't recall the fine detail of if there was correspondence and so on. I'd need to refresh my memory.
Well, in the time available, I don't think we've got time to go through that. So I will...
It's not going to come out of your time, Mr. Simblett. I'll be generous with you too. Can I just follow up a point being made by Mr. Simblett? If you know, it's a point Mr. Simblett was making about the IPC, or you made in your answer. If you know, as the HSE, that it is airborne, and if you know that surgical masks aren't sufficient, you surely can't, in accordance with your statutory duties, just say, well, we'll follow whatever the IPC cell says. Should you? I mean, shouldn't you then say, well, we've got a statutory duty to protect, as Mr. Stanton said, 750,000 healthcare workers. Shouldn't you step in?
I think that's what we were doing at that time, in that the knowledge and evidence at the time, at the start of the pandemic, about routes of transmission was reflected in the IPC guidance. Had we thought that that was falling short of what we thought was going to be the exposure routes, we would have advised accordingly and stepped in.
But you were part of the IP. I mean, there was an HSE representative as part of the IPC cell, wasn't there?
Yes, we had input into that, and we were there looking at the reasonable practicability of the precautions and being able to use those to satisfy their legal obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act.
So to that extent, and picking up on the question my lady just asked, the HSE was part of the IPC cell and in a position to pass on to the IPC cell those views as to what was required and what was insufficient, and in a position to say, actually, there's a statutory duty to enforce this.
We were inputting into that cell as to what was required, yes.
All right. The document, my lady, I'm assisted, it's April 2020, the document to which I referred to. So right at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question on that?
Oh, sorry. I think I've asked my question.
Okay,
Sorry, Mr. Grant.
It was the one where it was about the document that summarised the risk factors, and that you knew by April 2020 it was an airborne disease.
Yeah. You knew it was airborne, infectious persons expel virus-containing aerosols, and the concentration of the virus is greatest, therefore, within 1 metre. My final question is this. COVID doesn't smell, it's invisible, it's silent, you can't detect it by any normal non-laboratory means. So would you agree, as a health and safety expert, that there's no realistic way that an individual healthcare worker could carry out their own individual risk assessment as to what equipment they would require when doing their job?
I'd agree entirely, but it's not their responsibility to carry out a risk assessment, it's their employer's responsibility. We didn't expect individual healthcare workers to be carrying out individual assessments.
No, thank you very much. My lady, those are the questions answered.
Thank you, Mr. Simblett. Does that complete I think that completes the core participant questions.
I think so.
Yep, nobody's protesting. Right, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Grant. Very grateful for your help.
Thank you very much.
And now, Mr. Scott.
Sorry. Thank you, Lady. May we please call Sarah Gorton? Oh, apologies, yes.
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting, Ms. Gordon.
Ms. Gordon, would you please give your full name?
I'm Sarah Gorton.
And would you please give your current role?
So my job title is National Secretary and I work for the trade union Unison.
And I think as part of your role, are you co-chair of the NHS Staff Council?
So during the relevant period, I was Unison's Head of Health and co-chair of the NHS Staff Council and the NHS Social Partnership Forum.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to those points. I want to start at effectively just before the beginning of the pandemic. You've set out in your statement a large number of concerns that the TEC have in relation to, I think you call it the funding crisis in the NHS. If I can just read you what's part of the executive summary of the Module 1 report of the UK COVID-19 inquiry. It states, in 2020, the UK lacked resilience. Going into the pandemic, there had been a slowdown in health improvement and health inequalities had widened. High pre-existing levels of heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness and obesity, and general levels of ill health and health inequalities meant that the UK was more vulnerable. Public services, particularly health and social care, were running close to, if not beyond, capacity in normal times. You wouldn't disagree with any of that, I presume?
Not at all, no.
I want to focus your questions in relation to not so much staffing levels or the reason for staffing levels, but on your understanding of the impact of the pandemic on staff and the resilience that they were able to have as a result. Were you aware of any pre-pandemic plans for how NHS staff would be used or deployed to respond in the event of a pandemic?
So I think there are two or three broad points to mention here. So I think the first is that trade unions and myself weren't deeply involved in the planning. You have the statement that we refer to in the witness statement that the Staff Council put together. And this was
I'll come to that in a minute. This is just because this is, I think, around February time, maybe, the Staff Council statement. Is that right?
Produced at the end of January 2020.
But prior to that, you weren't aware of any kind of formal plans or anything along those lines?
We weren't involved in those discussions, no.
Okay. You've just referred to the Staff Council. Could you please describe what the NHS Staff Council is and who's involved in it?
So the NHS Staff Council is the collective bargaining body. So it's set up to bring trade unions and employers together with the Department of Health officials to maintain the contract of employment, the set of pay terms and conditions that are common to staff who are currently described as Agenda for Change staff. So these are all the non-medical staff in the NHS. It also has a range of subgroups, such as the health and wellbeing subgroup, where we interact with external bodies and look at issues like the health and wellbeing of the workforce of the NHS. So it's an opportunity to maintain that contract, to bring people together to try and service it, and to produce advice and guidance that goes out into the employing organisation where it can be picked up and implemented by trade union representatives working in partnership with their employers in the NHS organisations. It's a UK-wide body, but within Scotland, Cymru, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are also separate bodies that look at the particular issue for those jurisdictions.
Okay. But it is I know there's a different meaning in terms of partnership, a more formal kind of partnership arrangement, but the Staff Council is a kind of partnership between unions, employers and department officials. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's separate to the Social Partnership Forum.
Yes. If we can please go to INQ 0003 339374. And I think this is the Staff Council statement that you were just referring to. Are you able to just remind me, I think you said the date, but remind me roughly when this statement was actually made?
January 2020, I think.
Because we can see at the third paragraph, at the time of writing, cases and suspected cases of COVID-19 are being managed in specialist units. I presume that's a reference to within an HSID setting at that point in time. So we can kind of identify the time in January from that. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Just want to understand a little about how this statement came to be made. Could you explain the process that led up to this?
So this was the result of work mainly through that health and wellbeing partnership group of the Staff Council, and that is a body that's made up of a mixture of trade union representatives. A lot of those people are people with a good grounding in health and safety, well linked into trade union health and safety representative structures, working with employers to produce guidance. And as you can see at the end of the statement, they've made reference to quite a lot of the evidence that was available at the time and being produced by the health protection bodies across the UK.
And what was the intended purpose of this statement?
So the purpose of the statement, I think it's fairly clear in setting this out at the start, that what we're trying to do here is urge local partnerships, by which I mean employers and trade unions working together within employing organisations, to not only use this but to consult the latest advice and to work together to put in place the measures that are described in the guidance statement.
Well, if we can just go down and have a look at some of those measures, please. Thank you. There are 12 on the pages that I have. I know there's some further on. I'm not proposing to take you through all of them, but they cover issues such as communicating risk about transmission, identifying and mitigating risks arising from COVID-19, ensuring adequate PPE, making sure there's sufficient fit testing, training for PPE, maintaining non-COVID services, allowing staff or making sure staff are able to raise concerns in a way that doesn't impose any detriment, managing risks to vulnerable staff, e.g. those with suppressed immune systems, maintaining care for staff members. When you read back this statement, what do you think when you actually look about whether you identified essential principles for how a healthcare system should have responded to the pandemic?
I think most of the issues that we dealt with throughout the rest of the pandemic from this point onwards were rooted here. So all of the key principles to adhere to were set out. I think the question is to what extent those principles were able to be put in place is, that's was and how these were interpreted and implemented at a localised level was the major difficulty. You can see here the focus on making sure that people who are looking after COVID patients, who are working with PPE, have access to lots of rest, the link between fatigue and burnout. And you know from your own experience of the pandemic that situation was not, didn't come to pass in the way that people were expected to work. When you look at some of the evidence that we've provided in the witness statement, there were signs prior to the pandemic that people were already burnt out. We as trade unions had been raising the impact of
Sorry to cut across, Ms. Gorton. I will be coming to those points. I just want to focus on, I think you would call them the key principles.
Yes.
Here, because one point before I forget is you're talking about all the key principles were set out. Do you think, in terms of an early stage, or dare one say a kind of plan, in the loosest possible sense of how to respond to a pandemic, is essentially set out in very broad form, but set out in this statement?
I think the principles are here. Putting them in place is obviously requires further work at local level, but the principles, yes, I would agree.
And on reflection, do you think that there are any principles that you missed?
I think all of the principles are in here. I think looking at that second bullet point, there obviously needed to be a lot more guidance about identifying who might be more vulnerable and anticipating that.
But that's the delivery of this principle. Is that what you're saying? As opposed to, you've got the principle right, how it's then delivered is a different matter.
That's right, and all the guidance that might need to sit behind it.
So, in terms of identifying the key principles of a pandemic response, and particularly to the early stages of COVID-19, this had been foreseen by a group involving the unions, NHS employers and Department of Health officials in January 2020?
I think so, yes.
I'll move on now to some of the other points about how they were necessarily implemented. But firstly, what was the resilience level, do you think, of not the system, but of the NHS staff themselves, whether medical, non-medical, the whole panoply of the members of the NHS? How were they able to withstand a pandemic in January 2020?
So this is what I was picking up in response to your earlier question, that there were signs going into the pandemic for the few years in the run-up that the workforce had been largely overlooked and neglected in favour of a government and policymakers who seem to be obsessed with structure, system architecture, rather than addressing the needs of the workforce.
I phrased the question very badly. It's their own individual capacity. For example, the TUC report from 2020, titled The NHS Workforce Crisis, a Decade in the Making, is talking about, in 2019, high levels of work-related stress. And then it talks about work-related stress. You have the Unison Safe Staffing Forum in 2020 talking about whether NHS staff have sufficient skill mixes on their team. In terms of that personal capacity, rather than the systems, in terms of that personal capacity, do you think, how was the NHS workforce at that point?
Well, that survey that you just referred to, if you look at that, it paints a picture of people who describe themselves at breaking point. So it talks about the impact that people described just in that one snapshot survey of not having enough staff, not having access to the breaks they need in order to work the shifts. It talks about the pressures that they feel under to accept more work in order to cover the gaps. And it talks about the personal impact that they felt at the time from feeling that they didn't have what they needed in order to deliver the services they wanted to the standards they wanted to deliver them to patients. And it describes people feeling very vulnerable, talking about turning up for work, dreading their shifts, not being able to be hydrated properly during their working hours, and feeling constantly under pressure while they were there. And that's not a description of a resilient workforce ahead of a major crisis. Ahead of a major crisis, you want people to feel well motivated and well rested and able to deal with it. And the signs were there in that report and other evidence that this was not the condition of the NHS workforce.
Just want to bookend that with what you set out in your statement about March 2022 about staff wanting to leave the NHS was the pressure that they felt at not being able to deliver the appropriate quality and standard of care, and that staff were traumatised by the ability to deliver care at the level and quality that they're required to. Again, leaving aside considerations of funding, is there anything that can be done to prevent staff leaving because of those concerns?
So, working conditions are everything. You can see in the statement the themes that workers were raising through their unions about not enough access to rest breaks, about not enough access to the rest and recuperation they needed. And trade unions knew as early as May 2020, we were raising issues at a central level to call for support packages to be put in place to allow the rest and recovery from dealing with that first phase. As it turned out, that was a hiatus rather than an end, as we might have imagined at that point. But the signs were there that the workforce were already suffering. And by the period that you refer to, by 2022, it was really evident that that support hadn't been provided in sufficient measure to make people feel resilient enough and to make them motivated to want to stay in their jobs.
You say that you've been raising issues from May 2020. So, and then you talked about the hiatus. Was anything done during that hiatus to help the healthcare workers who'd been through that initial wave?
So in the statement, you'll see the pieces of work that trade unions contributed to over that time. A lot of work was done to set up what was called health and wellbeing portals to provide access to the sort of emergency mental health triage, hotlines and on-the-spot occupational health type interventions. And you can see some of those described in the statement. But what's really clear is that what health workers needed was an opportunity for rest and recuperation, and with the levels of staffing in the NHS as they were ahead of the pandemic and compounded by the pandemic, that was really difficult to achieve. So although there were measures put in place, it's clear that it was going to be a really uphill struggle to try and provide support in enough measure. And to an extent, a lot of the impact will take a long time to work through.
In terms of working through, you do say that the impact of the pandemic on recruitment and retention in healthcare may not become entirely clear for some time. Even now, is it starting to become clear?
So recruitment and retention in the NHS it's a very complex web, and it's difficult to pick apart exactly what part the pandemic had in this. But you can see from the evidence that we've provided that by 2021, 1 in 5 health workers were telling us that they were seriously or very seriously considering leaving their job in the NHS. So it had a profound impact on those workers and in the ability of the NHS to recruit staff. That came on top of several factors leading up to the pandemic, which had made it more difficult to retain staff of the NHS. Lots of those are referred to in the statement, so I won't go into them in detail unless you wish me to at this stage. But it's very clear that the effects of having low staffing going into the pandemic had contributed to the way people felt approaching the pandemic, that worsened during the pandemic, and as a consequence, it was more difficult for the NHS to recruit and retain staff. Staff morale seems to be levelling out to some extent. If you look at the latest NHS staff survey for England, at least, confidence does seem to be restored in some areas, but it's the pandemic had a very marked impact on health workers for all the reasons I'm sure you will be talking about to me and other witnesses.
In terms of the steps that were taken during the pandemic to increase numbers of healthcare workers, we had the kind of a reserve scheme that was brought in. There was the student registration scheme, issues like that across all different types of healthcare workers. From your staffing perspective, what were the merits or the benefits of those schemes? And are there any issues that the Chair should look at in terms of any improvements that could be made to those schemes moving forward?
So I personally, and to my knowledge, the trade union structures weren't engaged proactively on the decisions to set these schemes up. The point at which I came into contact with them, the core decisions about whether those approaches should be taken had already been made. So we engaged...
Presumably you didn't think it was a bad thing to put those in place?
Well, it's not that they were any of those suggestions were bad. It's that there are practical and feasibility issues that I think we could have pointed out if those had been discussed with us in advance. So, for example, on the Nightingale hospitals, it's very, very impressive that these buildings were acquired and converted so quickly. But I think in the statement we refer to a King's Fund report that kind of points out some of the practical and feasible difficulties in using them for the purpose that for which they were set up, such as the difficulty transporting people between hospital sites and the Nightingales. And for our part, I think the trade unions would have been asking questions about how the staffing arrangements might have been set up and working. So as was there the capacity to deliver them anyway, given what we knew about staffing in the NHS? What would the arrangements have been between different providers? Some of those issues we were able to work through. Those happened at a much more localised level, but they could have been anticipated in advance. So it's those sort of issues where the principles seem right, but actually the ability of those schemes to really deliver was hampered by a range of factors.
I'm going to put you on the spot a fraction. You say they could have been foreseen. Had you foreseen those difficulties just in and around the time that they were being established? And if so, did you communicate those difficulties?
I do remember having lots of conversations about the reserves scheme, and in particular what the people that were signing up. There were lots of very well-meaning people who wanted to help out. So the limits about what those people could do, I think I do recall that we had conversations through trade union structures, and I personally had conversations about how those people could be used. I think you've got evidence in the witness statement about suggestions that trade unions put forward about how those volunteers could be used to supplement the testing.
Yes.
Process. So there were some practical suggestions that we were putting forward at that time. But as I say, we weren't proactively engaged in the discussions about them at the time those ideas were being developed.
Okay. So in terms of those who were deemed vulnerable or who were working from home, do you think that sufficient use was made of the skills and capabilities of people who were vulnerable or for working from home? For example, could more use have been put into NHS 111 or triaging or using those skills remotely in any way, shape or form?
I think the only comments I can offer on that topic are about the impact that suddenly converting to having to run services from home had on the people that I talked to, the health workers I was working with. So most of these were people who do jobs where their job satisfaction, their whole role is in providing face-to-face services. The bond they feel with their patients is really deep and is part of their work. And in the scramble to turn their services into COVID-safe services, a lot of that was lost. And that had a profound impact on the job satisfaction for those people. They felt it had a profound impact on the services that they were able to provide. And if you think yourself about the way that we suddenly had to adapt and find new ways of reaching people through our computer screens and our phones, that's very different from the services that had previously been provided by staff working in therapy services. If you imagine being an occupational or a physiotherapist, suddenly having to deliver interventions through a computer screen, that had a very big impact. So I think that's the extent of the response I can give you on those issues.
Well, in terms of people who are obviously, the ideal is that people would not be moved out of their patient-facing roles. In the event of a future pandemic, say that was unavoidable for a myriad of reasons, is it going to be beneficial for those workers and for the NHS or HSC to make use of those workers? And is it also going to be beneficial for them that use is made of them if they have to be at home rather than not being able to assist in any way?
Completely, and I think in the statement we do refer to evidence that we heard from people who were available for work but not called upon, and those people felt disenfranchised and forgotten. So I think for future learning, it's very important to consider how the planning can take those people into account. I think there are probably lessons about fragmentation that may need to be looked at. Certainly the fact that the test and trace effort was being run separate to the health service probably meant those people couldn't be integrated into that effort in the same way. I'm sure you'll have other expertise on those matters.
My lady, I think that may be a convenient moment for the afternoon break.
I shall return at 3:10. All right. I hope you're warned, Miss Scotland, that we take breaks. Scott.
Thank you, my lady. Ms. Gordon, you were talking earlier on about the partnership. Well, you referred earlier on to the partnership. I'd like to move to that now. The NHS Social Partnership Forum, can you describe what that is, please?
So the Social Partnership Forum body is an England-wide structure that brings together trade unions with employers and policymakers through a central body called the Social Partnership Forum. We have our terms set out in a formal partnership agreement that all parties signed up to, and we discuss workforce policy matters through a series of formal meetings with a wider group meeting that is held normally quarterly, chaired at ministerial level.
Okay, so I think the way that you say in your statement is that it ensures ministers, civil servants and system leaders are made aware of the real-time concerns of healthcare staff.
That's true.
Yeah. And were there equivalents in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland?
Yes, they're all structured slightly differently, but there are bodies across the whole UK that bring trade unions and policy makers together.
Okay. And there was a separate group, the COVID-19 SPF, I'll just shorten it to SPF if you don't mind, engagement group, which met from the 30th of March and met weekly initially until July, when it started to meet fortnightly, which provided detailed conversation upon topics like guidance, policy positions. Is that a summary of the engagement group?
Yes. So at the start of the lockdown, we adapted the social partnership forum structures, and those loosely fell in 3 different groupings. So we created a new group, the COVID engagement group, that, as you say, met weekly, and we had a standing agenda, and you've got a sample in my statement of some of the issues that were regularly discussed through that meeting. There's topics like PPE, testing, vaccines, as that was added to the suite of measures as we went on. So that was the COVID engagement group. We also used social partnership structures to subsume some of the work of the Staff Council, which I talked about earlier. So we had been able to influence, through trade union routes, a set of temporary terms and conditions that were put in place to support the safe working and to prevent financial detriment on the health workforce for people who were had to work during the pandemic, or were in a variety of different categories like self-isolating, shielding, etc. So we also had a standing terms and conditions group that met. So I think at certain points they were meeting several times a week in order to take forward the technical work, and then we were able to convene one-off workshops or meetings on specific topics, and in the statement I gave a few examples of the kind of topics that we discussed.
So really, it gave you a very good, close access to a number of central decision makers about the healthcare system, dealing with important topics and policy points. Is that in a nutshell?
It did bring us into contact with people. I think 2 points that I think are probably important to make. One is that obviously the range of topics that we were discussing and the busyness of the people we were discussing them with, obviously we did our best on the trade union side to marshal our resources properly and to use that time as efficiently as we could. So we would have pre-meetings, for example, before every meeting, knowing who was coming, so that we didn't duplicate questions, that we asked things as efficiently as possible and didn't waste the time of people who were managing big parts of the pandemic response. But the other point I would make is that the really critical work to keep workers safe and interpret all the central guidance happened at organisational level. So this was the work that trade union representatives in every workplace did with their employers in order to take what we were doing at national level, take that guidance and convert it into measures to keep people safe, to interpret all of the information that was coming out, and most importantly, to feed back up to us issues where guidance was being received, and wasn't clear, or where there were issues where there was confusion or clashes, perceived clashes between different pieces of advice.
Just to follow on with that thread, was there a difficulty in doing that because there effectively been a loss of the middle layer of engagement?
So the structural reforms that had taken place in the NHS over the preceding decade had stripped out the sort of middle layer in the NHS. So the layer that was previously there in England and filled by the strategic health authorities. And those were a route often for trade unions to have intervention and engagement with employers and with officials over workforce policy matters and practical measures. So that layer wasn't there. So that had denuded systems and structures to an extent. But the same pressures that I talked about that were on health workers, trade union representatives are health workers themselves in the NHS. So the trade union structures had also been reporting through the Staff Council for a few years before the pandemic that people were saying to us that they were finding it more and more difficult to get access to time to participate in those structures. So there were signs of strain on capacity from the trade union side as well, and it was more difficult, particularly for people in clinical roles and from team leader roles, to participate in partnership working at trust level.
Ms. Gordon, you have an excellent habit of foreshadowing all of my questions. So I'm just going to ask you about some of the conversations that were taking place. If I can please have up on the screen INQ, and I hope I have the right number here, INQ 000119027. Thank you. And so this is the SPF wider group. This is the group as opposed to the forum, is that right? So the slightly more detailed analysis.
So the wider group is wider because it involves more people.
Right. Thank you. And this is the 3rd of June, 2020. And if we can go down, please, to page 3. And it's that bottom header, BAME strategy/action plan. And then what response can they make to the disproportionate impact due to COVID? So this is a presentation from people from NHSE, is that correct?
That's true, yes.
And so it's been recognised even in June 2020 that this was an issue about protecting, engaging and supporting staff. Those are the key questions. And then if we can just go over the page, please. And if we can just please go to the 4th paragraph, if that could be highlighted. So this is the note of the meeting saying, aware of the trust and psychological issues that have arisen amongst BAME colleagues due to support and PPE and other issues. These colleagues do not trust us. They're looking to their communities for support, and we need to go there to assist. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Some of these engagements led to cultural awareness of some of the policies and procedure impacts on some colleagues. That seems quite an open and honest assessment that NHSE had lost the trust of a number of healthcare workers. Was that the impression that you were taking from those meetings at that time in June 2020?
I recall this conversation very well, and it was an honest response to the issues that were coming through in the data and the issues that we were referring as trade unions as well. So I think your categorisation is correct, yes.
Well, what was done after June 2020 to rebuild that trust?
So,
maybe you're not the correct person to answer this question, but from your perception.
So I was going to say, you know, I'm not the person whose trust was breached, and you will be able to follow up with others. But I ask it a slightly different way?
From your perspective, from your role with staffing, was enough done to rebuild the trust?
I was at an event that the TUC held last week, where we had the opportunity to talk to staff who'd been through the pandemic, staff from black backgrounds, and the feeling in the room was clearly that not enough had been done either before the pandemic or since. I think what you're seeing on this set of notes is that there is a recognition of the need to look at these issues. I think you will need to take further evidence from people better suited than me to tell you how successful that has been. But I think I refer in the elsewhere in the witness statement to a set of evidence that was given to the EHRC and to other bodies during the pandemic about the particular impact on black staff, and the issues that are set out here are specific to looking at some of the practical effects of the pandemic. but they don't reach into some of the concerns about structural racism that had been raised prior to the pandemic and still persist beyond it.
Okay. Ms Gordon, given your very helpful statement, your evidence statement, my questions are covered, my lady. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr Scott. And I think there are some full participant questions. Who's going first? Ms Hannett. There you are. When looking round to your right, if the questions are likely to come from either behind you or to the right, could you make sure that you do speak into the microphone, because that's where we get your evidence recorded. Thank you.
Ms Gordon, I appear on behalf of the long COVID groups, and I want to ask you a couple of questions arising out of a letter sent by healthcare unions to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, on the 18th of February 2021. Please could we have INQ 000114832 on the screen? Ms Gordon, for your ease of reference, I think that's also at tab 15 of your bundle. Thank you. And if you see the date is at the top, the 18th of February 2021, addressed to the Prime Minister and the health ministers of each of the 4 nations. The title you'll see is Protecting Healthcare Workers, and at the bottom of the first page, the last paragraph, health and care workers are at 3 to 4 times greater risk of developing and dying from COVID-19 than the general public. Over the top top of page 2, now no scientific doubt that COVID-19 spreads via the airborne route. Third paragraph, the current UK infection prevention and control guidance does not accurately depict the airborne risks. The letter sets out 5 potential courses of action to be taken, and then the paragraph immediately after those 5 points towards the bottom of page 2. We have addressed this letter to you because your agencies and departments have not yet sufficiently responded to our concerns, and we're aware that a review of the IPC guidance has been carried out, but we cannot agree with the apparent conclusions that the guidance should remain the same. Questions in following on from that document. Why did the TUC not have confidence in the review of the IPC guidance?
So I think the issues around PPE and around the IPC guidance that I refer to in the statement flag up, firstly, the practical impact of having a set of guidance that's constantly updated. Trade unions work really, really hard. We knew right from the start of the pandemic that if we had all worked separately and all reinterpreted the guidance and put those out through our separate networks, that would be 17 different sets of country guidance. So we worked really hard to work together, not only producing advice as joint unions, but actually making sure that wherever we could, we were a reputable source of information and referring people back to the original source documents. So the official IPC guidance, and in particular, the PPE specifications that were laid out in those, and worked with employers to supplement those through frequently asked questions to respond to issues of detail. And we produced those, and they were checked by the IPC specialists. Now, obviously, there were areas where the trade unions had been reflecting either confusion amongst the workforce with the status or the content, or where there were gaps. So early on in the pandemic, there was no reference to the situation that needed to be adopted in either community settings or ambulance settings. And we were hearing from workers in both of those settings that they were being expected to go in and out of homes where potentially they were being exposed to people who were COVID positive. And if you remember, at that time there was no testing, so they had no way of telling, people had no way of telling, other than having symptoms, whether they were COVID positive or not. So it's gaps like that we were able to flag. But this particular issue of the airborne nature was a gap that lots of professional bodies had been raising. I think it's important to note that the trade union structures themselves are industrial relations structures, so we don't have a role in setting or challenging scientific evidence. But I do remember this being a very hot topic, and what we did through trade union routes is that we were able to identify to policymakers where this was a gap, and to bring people together with policymakers to try and address it. And my recollection is that on this particular issue, we had a specific workshop convened through the Social Partnership Forum to bring together some of the professional bodies that were raising these issues around ventilation, around the airborne transmission route, together with the experts from Public Health England and other bodies to discuss the guidance. So our role was to flag the gaps, to identify where there was confusion. But it was very important to the trade unions that we were seen as a reputable source of information, and that we were there to flag up where the guidance had gaps and needed to be supplemented with other advice. And this issue was one of those gaps that was very clearly identified.
Ms. Scotton, that's helpful, thank you. Can I just check then that the points at bullet point 1 to 5 of that letter reflect the position of your union in February 2021?
So I think if you look at the signatories of the letter, that grouping is a group of professional bodies who've got specialisms in respiratory issues and in ventilation specialisms. That's not my own union's position, but we raised those issues through Social Partnership Forum structures.
I'm grateful. Thank you, Ms. Gorton.
Thank you, Ms. Howard. Mr. Wilcock.
Afternoon, Ms. Gorton. I represent the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families campaign. And I think it's right that your union, Unison, has 50,000 members in Northern Ireland, so you have some familiarity with the situation there. In your evidence this afternoon and in your statement, you spoke of the positives of the social partnership system, which, as I understand, is primarily an English NHS system, but there are equivalents in the devolved nations. And you mentioned those positives, including the fact that they enable unions to ensure that Ministers, civil service and system leaders were made aware of the real-time concerns of healthcare workers. Are you able to give us any examples of how the system could have worked better in England, first of all?
So I think my reflection on partnership as a principle is that it works best when people listen and then take action. And I think the statement identifies some areas where unions might have been saying things, but they weren't necessarily acted on. And there were some clear policies, like vaccination as a condition of deployment, where unions had been advising a particular course of action would be detrimental to a good vaccination campaign, for example. I referred earlier to the stripping out of that middle layer of the contact structures, and I think that that means that without that middle layer, either issues are more frequently raised, fast-tracked, either through to NHS England, through employer structures, or through to people like me and my colleagues in sort of UK trade union structures, or what's most likely not raised at all. So I think you do miss out on those. And I think the lack of involvement in the planning, particularly, I was thinking on the way in about previous experience in the run-up to the I can't remember the terminology. I think it was H1N1, the bird flu campaign, and I think we had quite a lot more involvement in the planning stages prior to that than I recall in COVID. So those are the three areas that I would just flag. Partnership working is only as good as the people that and the trust that you can generate in doing it, and it is dependent on those relationships that are cultivated. What we did at national level, was set out opportunities for proper partnership working at local level, but that feedback loop was rarely closed.
If I can stop you there, only because I'm obviously representing families from Northern Ireland, and you've said a lot of it depends on the trust that exists, and we know that the healthcare system and the political system in Northern Ireland is different. Are you able to make the same sort of comments, but this time specific to the situation in Northern Ireland?
So I was chair of the English partnership structure, so I wouldn't want to speak for colleagues in Northern Ireland. I know there is some reference in the statement to Northern Ireland, but very happy to address specific questions in writing afterwards through those colleagues.
Well, we might take you up on that. Thank you very much.
I'm happy you should, Mr. Wilco, if you decide you want to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sen Gupta, I think you're... Where are you? Oh, there you are. Can you see, if you look, you can see it?
Me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Can you see the witness?
I can see Miss Gorton. My lady, I'm sorry that I am not directly...
Don't worry, I'll survive.
Miss Gorton, I represent the Frontline Migrant Health Workers Group, and we've been given permission to ask you a few questions which relate specifically to the position of Filipino healthcare workers. First, I'll provide some brief context for the questions. Filipinos are the third largest national group in the NHS after British and Indian, but official data gathering does not include Filipino as an ethnic group for monitoring. The significant and disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Filipino community has been referred to by community organisations such as Kanlungan. In the first months of the pandemic, up to May 2020, Filipinos accounted for only 3.8% of the nursing workforce, but 22% of COVID-19 deaths among nurses. At paragraph 135 of your statement, you refer to the government's awareness of the potential disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers from a relatively early stage of the pandemic. And you also there refer to recognition of an urgent need to act to mitigate this impact from at least 6th of May 2020. Given your experience in advocating for NHS health staff, are you aware of any actions that were taken by NHS management during the relevant period for this module, which is the 1st of March 2020 to the 28th of June 2022, to monitor and/or address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Filipino nurses?
So I think the two aspects I would refer to, and I think are covered in the statement, are that from that point onwards, so from May, June of 2020, there was a re-engagement with that principle that's set out in that early Staff Council statement of the need for risk assessments. And so I am aware we were asked to contribute to to the provision of very specific risk assessment tools that were put together specifically to address issues of disparity. And there's evidence in the statement of the work of through the Social Partnership Forum to provide input into that. So the principle of risk assessment was that people's individual circumstances should be taken into account. So not just a tick box that was done looking at somebody's work environment, but actually taking their wider experience into account. So things like taking into account how people travel to work, their living circumstances, their family circumstances, etc., as well as looking at other factors like whether people had other health conditions, as well as the environments that they were working in. So risk assessments was one area where we know that piece of work was stepped up, and the figures that we were given, or we were
Ms. Gould, let me take this opportunity just to focus on the question that I was asking, which was about monitoring and addressing the disproportionate impact specifically.
This is what I was coming to, because we were asked to participate in the production of the tool, the risk assessment tool, and we received some information about compliance with the risk assessment tool. So I think at one point that I referred to in the statement, we were assured that 95% of trusts had completed their risk assessment processes. But what we asked for was information coming back to us about what was happening as a consequence of that. So what had changed for those people as a consequence of having those risk assessments. And that's the type of information that we didn't get back. So yes, there was work done, but I'm not aware of, and we didn't get responses to questions about what had happened as a follow-up. The other aspect of work that I'm aware did take place, and into which trade unions had some input, was the matter I referred to earlier about setting up of the health and wellbeing portals and the helplines. And I know that there were conversations about providing culturally specific elements of that helpline services. So those are the two areas of provision that I'm aware that NHSE put in place.
Thank you, Ms. Gorton. Is the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Filipino nurses an issue that was specifically raised by the TUC or Unison with NHS management during that relevant period?
I do remember us talking about the disproportionate impact on black staff in general, and I remember specifically in relation to the issue of the helpline discussions about impact on Filipino nurses and other Filipino workers. But beyond that, I can't recall specifics.
Ms. Gorton, Filipino nurses wouldn't come under the categorisation of black staff. I'm asking you specifically about...
Sorry, I should explain. I'm using black in the way that Unison defines black, so within the broader definition of black and minority ethnic staff.
Looking to the future, Ms. Gorton, do you agree that the inclusion of Filipino as a separate category of ethnic group in equality monitoring would assist in preventing and addressing such issues in the future?
I can't offer a view from my own organisation, but personally, it would certainly give visibility, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms. Sengupta. That completes the questioning for you, Ms. Gorton. I'm extremely grateful for your help. And I have got your written statement, and I promise you it's not just, people always think the inquiry is only about the oral evidence. It's not. It's about the oral evidence and the written material. So I can assure you, don't think on the bus on the way home, oh my goodness, I wish I'd said that, because I will take it all into account. Thank you very much. Right, I shall return for a 10:30 start on Monday the 16th September.
All right.